On.
Okay.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Caregiver Teleconnection. My name is Glenda Rogers and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's session with Dr. Natalee Oliver, one of our frequent presenters, and we're so glad about that. Today we're going to be talking about caregiving with grief, loss, and trauma. A difficult topic, but one that we need to look at and talk about. So Natalee, tell us just a little bit about yourself and how you got into this line of work.
Sure. I was in school at Baylor and I was about to graduate with a business degree, and they wrote the word gerontology on the board and they wrote free lunch. And that is how I went and learned about what gerontology is and fell in love with it. And so I've been a counselor, and this was something, grief and loss and trauma was pretty common. And so it wasn't something I set out to work with a lot, but it was something that I needed to. And so because it's just an important topic.
It is indeed.
All right. Are we ready to get started?
We are.
Okay. Here we go. So here just has a summary of today's topic, and then I will also provide all the information today in a PDF format so you can have it, share it, you can use it to present, whatever. I'm fine with you using the information. This just tells you a little bit more about my background. Like I said, I've worked in counseling, adults and older adults, many different things going on. My heart has always been working with caregivers, especially those taking care of someone living with a form of dementia. And actually, my aging parents moved in with my husband and I about 2.5 years ago. My dad is in the middle stages of dementia. So I've also got that side of it now as well. So I want to touch on some basics of trauma. And we know that trauma impacts our entire system. It can impact us physically, where it impacts our sleep, our appetite, digestion. It can impact us emotionally. We can even have feelings of pain, anger, shame, guilt. There can be survivor guilt. Mentally, we can have difficulty concentrating, retaining information. Spiritually, we can, what's the meaning of life and get angry with God. Socially, relationships with family, friends, and strangers. And I love this article I was reading, and they said, we're like a sponge for stress and trauma, and we accumulate it until there's no space to accumulate anymore. And they also talked about, on a neurological level, trauma creates this emergency highway in the body. And so during trauma, then all of our senses are activated, they kind of blend together. And so once this highway is created, it pretty much never goes away. And so some people have a hard time getting off of that highway. Some people re-enter the highway. Um, and what it's talking about is that even sometimes we're not even aware of the triggers that have occurred getting us back on the highway. Trauma, if you've gone to any trainings, a lot of times you'll hear of the 3 E's. It comes from a traumatic event or series of events. Everybody has an individual experience with it, and then everyone has different effects. And so trauma is definitely a life-changing experience. And something else to keep in mind is trauma can happen at any time, at any age. And sometimes people will have trauma younger and maybe they've suppressed it or they've coped with it. But something can trigger it, 20, 30 years down the road, maybe when you're caregiving. And so it can be a single incident, it can be long-term chronic pattern of trauma. And so there's just a lot that goes into trauma. But some of the examples of traumatic events that we usually think of are any kind of abuse, like physical, sexual, emotional. Trauma can come from living with a family member with physical or mental health conditions or substance abuse disorders, domestic violence, sexual assault. If you have a sudden death of a loved one, chronic poverty, racism, discrimination, oppression, violence in the community, or living through natural disaster. And so I know a lot of times back in the day, we would think it was only people in the military, but you can see here, this hits a lot of people. And this right here, I like it. It's gives you a list of the symptoms. It's called a trauma checkoff list. And you don't have to experience all of these. You might go through some of these, and you might have some of these symptoms some of the time. But especially if these are not part of your regular personality, like outbursts of anger or rage, emotional mood swings, nightmares and flashbacks. People experiencing trauma tend to isolate themselves and difficulty trusting others. And then, of course, you see the physical things at the top: headaches, backaches, changes in sleep patterns, constipation, easily startled. That's a common one as well. So this is just a good checkoff list that you can look at to see, wow, do I have this many symptoms? Trauma has the potential to shift your worldview. It also can shift your sense of self, of who am I? And then, of course, it can affect your relationships with others. And a really sad statistic from the National Council for Behavioral Health says 70% of adults in the US have
Wow.
experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their life.
Mm.
And then if you look at public behavioral health, over 90% of clients have experienced some type of trauma. And so trauma is a risk factor to get PTSD or substance abuse and other types of disorders. And here I just want to point out that the response to trauma is very unique. We're going to, talk about some general things today, but two people can go through the same event. You could have grown up and your sibling and you've gone through the same thing, and that each of you experience it totally different. The same with caregiving and losing people to, once they die, you could experience those different because it depends on what you're going through, your relationship with them. There's just so many factors. And so it's just very unique. But trauma can lead to difficulties that negatively impact life on a daily basis. So here are some of the things that people with trauma can lead to. They start to detach themselves from others. They feel detached, just not connected, jaded, or fearful, or mistrusted. We talked about that earlier. They don't feel safe. And it can really put a strain on relationships. And they have a difficulty regulating their emotions or controlling their emotions. They may have a decline in performance at work and cognitive or thinking. Your brain, you could have some troubles with memory or some trouble focusing. And it can turn into where there's clinical, like I talked about, PTSD, and just other conditions that could occur if you don't get help, if you're experiencing some of these symptoms. So again, the long-term effect is that could turn into PTSD. So now I want to touch on grief and loss. A lot of times when we say grief and loss, we are thinking about uncomplicated or what we call simple grief. And so this is what most people think of when a loss occurs, and people may cry, sleep. They may have some appetite changes, maybe some anger, depression. But these symptoms they're going through are generally strongest at the beginning. And they start to lessen over time, and they generally return back to a new normal. That, again, is what we would call uncomplicated or simple grief. This one is one that a lot of caregivers go through, and it is called anticipatory grief. This is when the grief starts before the person has actually died. This happens a lot when they're on hospice, and this can happen a lot when your loved one has a form of dementia. You're grieving, they're still physically there. A lot of times you've heard the term ambiguous loss. They physically look the same on the outside, but inside they're different because of the disease. And so you can start that grief process while they're living. You can start grieving who they used to be. Um, and a lot of times when you're going through this anticipatory grief on a daily basis, it can be just as painful as the loss that's associated with the actual death. And a lot of times, caregivers will have a lot of guilt or shame because at times they can get so exhausted and have their own issues going on that they sometimes will wish that caregiving's over. And then they'll feel guilty. How could I have that thought on someone that I love? And I hope that you hear me say today that those feelings are very normal. And it doesn't mean that we are bad people to have those feelings because we're humans and caregiving's hard. But on a less negative um, point, anticipatory grief can help us prepare for the inevitable. So if we're losing someone in these stages, that when the actual death occurs, it may not be as difficult as it could have been if we had not gone through those. We also have what's called delayed grief. This is very common as well. And these are not mutually exclusive. You could have the anticipatory grief as well as the delayed. And this is when someone actually does die, and we're so busy with maybe making arrangements and family coming in, and we don't even have time to stop and have the grief. Now, it could be we just are in denial and we don't want to accept it. But it also could be there's just so many different practical things to do that your mind and your heart just don't even go there. And so this can happen a lot if you've cared for someone for a long time and you're just not going there when it actually happens. So it might hit at a later time. And so that's again why we talk about grief is so unique, just like trauma is so unique, what we go through. We have some general guidelines, but again, we all go through it differently. And this one I just wanted to briefly and talk about in case you've heard about it. It's called disenfranchised grief. And this is when a caregiver or a loved one feels like they can't really openly talk about it or acknowledge it because society or family or work has really kind of pressured them to move on. And so the example this article talks about is someone going through a miscarriage and that they may feel like, wow, everyone said, oh, I'm really sorry for you, but let's move on and get back to life. But disenfranchised grief can happen with anything, with you, if you're a caregiver of someone with cancer or with dementia. Again, it's if you feel like for whatever reason, you can't really openly talk about it, experience and process it, and just get that support that you need. But the thing to remember is no matter which type of grief you're going through, grief is a natural emotion. It's a universal experience, meaning all of us go through it. All of us lose something sometime. Yet a lot of times we feel so isolated and alone when we're going through it. Um, Grief can be so intense and it can be so uncomfortable that a lot of times we try to find ways to avoid it. It's very natural. So we might try to distract ourselves, or we might try to stay busy because then if I stay busy, then and I have noise around me, then I don't have to stop and think and feel. And so it might take longer to heal from a loss than you expected, because we might put these rules. A lot of times we have the shoulds and these rules we put on ourselves. And so, what I would really encourage you to do is to give yourself time to grieve before you just start saying, I should move on at this time. Um, Something that's key as well. It's very interesting to me though, because we say this, and you may have even said that we all grieve differently, but it's this human nature as well, where we think, why are they not grieving like me? Man, they sure don't seem very sad. So it's an interesting thing we have there where we know it's unique, but then we do expect people to kind of grieve how we grieve. And so just to be cognizant of that and realize we really do grieve differently. And so it's really important to get support. You can get it from family, clergy, therapists, grief support groups, etc. And specifically on grief and caregivers, a lot of times caregivers have to learn to forgive themselves once this person has died. And they may even need to forgive the person who has died because maybe because they were so sick, they didn't always treat them so well. Maybe they had the first part of their relationship, there could have been abuse, and then you still are their caregiver. And so you're having to work with some of the pain maybe you never dealt with. We grieve because we're deprived of that person. It's hard. That sense of loss. A lot of times for caregivers, it's this change in roles where who am I now? I've been a caregiver for so long. I remember when I worked, there was this one particular nursing facility here in Waco where it was for Alzheimer's and dementia. Many of the spouses, after their loved one died, would still come up there because they didn't know what to do next. It was that role of who they were. And so a lot of times, caregivers can go with changes in their circumstances, and that can cause a lot of fear of what is ahead. And so, again, financial changes, where am I going to live? And you can get very overwhelmed. And so sometimes you might have family and friends that can support you, but sometimes they don't know what to do. And so you might have to get professional help as well. This right here is a grief intensity scale. And if you, they'll email this out and you can click on the link. This is a great thing for you to do. I'm going to show you some of the questions and to kind of see where you're at because you might think, oh, I'm doing really bad, or you might think I'm fine. But if you go through this and answer it honestly, for instance, do you feel yourself longing or yearning for the person who died? And you answer this Likert scale from not at all the way to overwhelmingly. So if you go through these questions, answer them, and then take it to your primary care physician, see what they say, see if they recommend if you need professional help or not. Look at number 10. Do you feel like you have trouble re-engaging in life? Problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, planning for the future. And then if you look at that last question, it says, have the symptoms above caused significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas? So if you're going through these, of course you might feel all of these, but to what degree? How much is it impacting your life? So this is just something that you could do, again, to kind of assess yourself and see where you're at. I want to talk about there's different theories when it comes to grief. And I know theories can be really dry, but theories are really important because they can help us understand the why. They can also help us anticipate in the future what might help. And so here I've pulled up some of the top different theories on grief. And what I wanted to do is share with you the ones that I've experienced as a therapist working with caregivers. And what I've noticed is that it's been a combination of the one a lot of you have heard of, the stages of grief, where you go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and you can go through them. You don't go through one, stop the next. You can go through them at different times and go back to one. But there's also a couple of others that I would say tie into caregivers a lot. And there's one called Warden's Task of Mourning. And this says that you accept the reality of the loss, you work through that pain of grief, which could be those denial, anger, bargaining, etc. You adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing, so you have that new normal, but you find an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. And then continuing bonds just really goes to that further, saying that we don't have to necessarily let go or move on. Instead, we have these continued bonds with someone for the rest of our life. And so these are some of the theories and some of what I've experienced working with caregivers and grief and loss. But the main thing to remember when it comes to these theories and when someone is going through grief and loss, like I've talked about, is even these theories, even research, all that can have this road that they say we're going to go along. But you can see from the visual here, this person made their own path. And that's the thing to remember is that, yes, there are certain things we can somewhat predict, but it's not in stone. Everyone walks through this differently. We know with grief, a lot of times when I'm working with my clients, I'll say it's like a roller coaster. Because with grief, one minute you can be crying, the next minute you can be angry, and the next minute you might remember something so funny about that loved one, you start laughing. So these emotions they're like a roller coaster and they're all over the place. That is normal to feel all of those things. But culture, religion, social norms, they do influence how comfortable we are with showing others our grief and our loss, and even how we'll admit it to ourselves. The culture, if it says, well, men are not supposed to cry, or I'm supposed to be the leader, or something like that. So that really can affect how someone will process the grief and loss they're going through. And then I mentioned this earlier. You may have had a previous loss, and you may say, well, I've lost a loved one to dementia. But if you lose another one to dementia, it can be a totally different experience. Because again, it depends on the situation and the relationship that you've had with them and where you're at this time of life when the second one occurs. But again, just like trauma affects your whole being, grief can too. It can affect you physically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually. And so each of us can have different symptoms. There's a lot of symptoms here, and I'm just going to touch on some of them. So some of the physical symptoms, you might notice your energy has really gone down to where you almost feel weak or fatigued all the time. You might have some stomach aches, headaches. You might start eating or sleeping too much or too little. You might just have this feeling of heaviness that can occur with grief and loss as well. Being reckless or self-destructive, maybe drinking too much or driving kind of carelessly just because you're grieving. And then emotionally, you might have some confusion. Guilt is, like I said, a big one. You might have yearning. I can't think of a better word, just yearning for that person that you lost. Might be some irritability. Sometimes grief and loss or depression can come out irritability as well. You might have this passive resignation. It doesn't mean you want to end your life. It just means you're just kind of apathetic. It's kind of, I'm just here right now. And then I talked about earlier these fluctuating emotions, that roller coaster of emotions. Spiritually, you might be questioning your faith. Um, you might be angry at God, or it might do the whole other end of the spectrum where you draw closer and feel like your faith is the only thing that can help get you through. And then socially, sometimes you want to isolate yourself and you might feel detached from others. You might be angry because you feel like others have moved on. And you're like, how can you move on like that? So, what's traumatic grief? We've talked about trauma and we've talked about some different types of grief. So, let's focus specifically on traumatic grief. Trauma can stem from many things. You see the visual on here, it can stem from grief and loss. Again, it can be other things we talked about earlier, but grief and loss is one of the things it can stem from. And so traumatic grief is when it's not expected. And so this can be traumatizing, and this can trigger intrusive, preoccupying thoughts, bodily responses, in addition to the mourning of what was unexpectedly lost. So you're going through this unexpected loss, but you're also having these other things occur to you emotionally and physically as well. And so again, we think about it when it's unexpected. And so this can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. And it can, especially if you already are living with a pre-existing mental health condition like depression or anxiety, doesn't mean for sure, it just means your risk does increase. We're going to go over, there's lots of symptoms of traumatic grief, and they're not exclusive from just traditional grief as well. But some of the traumatic grief can be nightmares, attempts to avoid all thoughts and activities associated with trauma, flashbacks, emotional numbness. You may feel just so much anger and unfinished business. So again, some of these symptoms may match, but they're more intense, they're more pervasive and persistent than regular grief. And then you can also have some of the physical things, loss of appetite, dry mouth, problems sleeping, trouble breathing, muscle weakness. Some other symptoms of traumatic grief can be where if you become preoccupied with the person who is deceased, if your memories are just too upsetting, if you find their death is just unacceptable, feeling your life is empty, if you're hearing the voice of the person who died, anger about their death, lonely most of the time. And so grief that follows a violent or sudden unexpected loss, again, is the traumatic grief. And traumatic grief is considered a risk factor for developing PTSD, as well as delayed grief. We talked about that earlier. Delayed grief is when just not coping with it happening then, so it may happen later. Again, the thing to remember is that grief itself is a normal process of adapting to what's just happened. But sometimes if it's too intense and too overwhelming, then that is when it might be time to get help. And so sometimes it's a good idea to get diagnosed and get treated. And I know no one likes labels, but the thing is, if we get this diagnosis of traumatic grief or whatever the mental health diagnosis is, sometimes we need to be in that sick role because it's the only time we're going to stop and we're actually going to get help. And for those of us that think I can't stop and I have to be perfect, if we get that diagnosis, then we can be like, well, I have to get help. It's okay. I'm allowed. I'm air quoting there. But because sometimes it takes getting to that point for us to get and accept help. I want to cover some coping strategies for grief and loss and traumatic grief as well. The first one's so hard, but if we can get a little bit better than we were today on it, that's what I'm asking here. And that's practicing tolerating uncertainty. Life after loss almost always involves some type of uncertainty, and the degree to which we can tolerate this uncertainty correlates to our overall sense of well-being. Just kind of knowing, hey, I'm not in control of everything, and that's okay. And I know that's really hard for some people. Something else to really think about in coping strategies is explore your personal ideals about loss. What was it like in your childhood? What role models did you see? How did they handle grief and loss? Maybe it was not healthy. Maybe it was really skewed. And so that's something to think about because we're a product of our environment. And so to really think, what was the environment I had and what were the examples? Something else you can do to cope is reconstruct your identity, because when you lose someone, your self concept is deeply impacted. You know, who did you understand yourself to be? Do you feel like it no longer aligns with who you are now? So really just acknowledge your roles and your identities that you have lost or that you'll never have. And then I love this. I read this in an article. It says, consider who you were, consider who you are, and then consider who you hope to be. And so really to just stop and take time to do that. Practice dialectical thinking. This is huge. This is something that I would work on with my clients in therapy, because a lot of times in life we do what's called black and white thinking, or all or nothing, right or wrong. And life we know is a lot of shades of gray. A lot of times, even though intellectually we know that, we don't often use that when we're processing our feelings and our grief. And so the thing I hope you hear today is two things that feel contradictory to one another can both be true. So what we're saying with this dialectical thinking is practice holding two truths at the same time. And so even though there might be times when you feel like your life is not worth living because you've lost your spouse of 60, 70 years, it still doesn't mean you can't still find joy in things in everyday life. Maybe you talk to an old friend or you have a pet. And so you don't have to have that guilt of, oh, I shouldn't feel this good. What we're saying is this is a good coping skill. I can feel sad and I can miss them, but I can also feel joy and happiness at the same time. And that's okay. That's actually healthy. But I do want to focus on guilt. There's so much guilt when it comes to caregiving, while you're caregiving and once the person dies. So you might even feel where at times, again, that relief. The relief is real. And with their death, there can be some freedom that does occur. And so some people don't share that relief that they feel because they think, oh, I'm a bad person. I don't want to be judged or misunderstood. But what I'm asking is, instead of that, can you be like, I feel relief, pat yourself on the back for what you did do and celebrate the caregiving that you did provide. And we have sometimes, you might have thought, maybe a week before they died, you had those thoughts of life would be so much easier if, and then say they end up dying in the next week or two. We have what's called this magical thinking, where we might go, oh my gosh, did I cause that? I mean, I wish that. Let me tell you, no, you did not. But it's a common thought that caregivers have of, did I have some kind of role in this because I had this thought that what would my life be once they're gone? So again, relief is normal. It's okay to feel comfortable with the relief. And what you can focus on is the self-acceptance of, you've done the best that you can do. You've probably done things that you didn't even think you could do as a caregiver, and realize the strength and this resilience that you had, and to focus on that. But again, it is normal to have those contradictory emotions. And so the literature talks about it's this sad relief. I'm sad I miss them, but I do feel relief physically and emotionally from the exhaustion. And also, please hear this, relief does not mean you're forgetting them. It does not mean that. Some other coping strategies for grief and loss: grief journaling. I talk about journaling probably in every presentation. Research backs it up. I journal, it works. If you can get what's in your heart and your mind onto paper, you're getting it on that safe, non-judgmental place. You do have the right to grieve in your own way. You may want to create rituals around the one that you lost. Maybe they enjoyed nature, so you plant some flowers. I mean, anything. Um, Remember, you're not alone in your suffering. Suffering and grief and loss is universal. We all go through it, even though it's unique to you. It is a natural part of the broader human experience. But sharing your loss with others is very beneficial. You can talk, you can listen, and you can reflect. And I always say support groups are great. I go to a support group for being a daughter of someone with dementia. I'm not Natalee, the professional educator. I'm Natalee, the daughter. And there's something about walking alongside others that are going through what you've been through. Restoring the broken mirror. This is an activity you might do if you went to therapy. And it's just using this metaphor of restoring who you are. And so you have this mirror and you think, okay, it's broken now. I've lost them. but let's put those pieces back together. It may look different, but it's still you. Something else a lot of times you might do in therapy is a letter to the deceased person. There might be things you didn't say. Again, we talked earlier about there might be some resentment, or there just might be sadness, or there might be something funny you want to share with them. But writing that letter can really help you through the grieving process. Also, another coping skill is that you are bigger than just the grief you're going through. And so, really looking at what are all of my strengths? What are my values in life? Because that can help center you and help you get through this grief and loss. And to remember, there's this fine line between avoidance and helpful distraction. And I just want to give you this visual. So you can say, if I do too little of comforting myself, you might be in that denial of what's going on. But if you do too much comforting of yourself, you might not be going through the grief and you might have that delayed grief. So what this visual is just showing is that you need to find this healthy balance of working through your grief. Some other helpful strategies is this evocative language. Sometimes we say pass away, but sometimes we need to say they're dead. They have experienced death. Sometimes psychologically we need to get to that point where we're saying those words. Symbols and reminders. Again, introducing humor is so important. Humor's free. Humor, you can bond with someone else. Sometimes reminiscing on that can help you work through it as well. Drawing. So some people say, I haven't drawn in 60 years. Drawing can be such a creative outlet. I've put here a drawing grief tool. And so you can work through this, and it just talks about drawing your grief and your feelings and your experience. And then it asks you some questions to reflect on your drawing. This could be so therapeutic. Just if you go to a quiet place, reflect your drawing, don't worry about showing it to anyone else, don't judge yourself, and just answer these questions. This is another article. I am not going to read all of these quotes, but it is a wonderful article. It's called Life Lessons from Grief. Grief Taught Me. And it's got people that have lost and different things that taught them. And so I picked out some of the top quotes that I thought were really good. And one of them was, there's no timeline certainty, no right or wrong way to grieve. Your loss is tremendous. You're doing great just to put one foot in front of the other and keep moving. Keep talking about them. Keep remembering the joy they brought. You have a gift to share, just as they did. And then the other one I wanted to talk about is the last one. It says, I've learned it is refreshing once you get a little more energy to make new friends who sometimes are closer than family. They accept who you are now rather than hoping you'll be the old you. And so I thought that was so important because we are changed when we lose, and we change in life all the time, but especially going through traumatic grief or just grief and loss can change who we are. So sometimes we want those old comfortable relationships. Sometimes that's why going to a support group and just making those new relationships of them meeting you where you are now, and no expectations of who you once were or who they want you to be. Something you can do if you have experienced traumatic grief, routine and structure is so important. It can make you feel safe. It can help you regulate your emotions, meaning, keeping them, I guess, in line or just regulating them. Again, knowing that your feelings are not uncommon, that there's nothing wrong with you, that you might need some extra support during this time. And so it's important to acknowledge how you're feeling, think about it, and then expressing it as well. This is important. We touched on it earlier, leaning on others. And this is just one study I thought was interesting. It was talking about this support group of people that had gone through traumatic grief. And it said that they appreciated it when people let them mention the name of the person they lost without being made to feel awkward or weird. And so, again, it's this club you don't want to be in, but you're glad that there's others to be there with you. Something else you can do is create a grief care plan. I love this. A lot of times when you're walking through grief, you don't remember how to take care of yourself. That's just not on your mind. Maybe you're not eating or remembering who you can call. Grief can hurt our memory. We talked about that earlier, one of the cognitive symptoms. And so we can do what we call a grief care plan. I love this. You can print this for you. And this is something you can print out, fill it out, hang it up on your refrigerator to remind yourself. First of all, you do my daily non-negotiables. This can be take my medicine, go to work, take a shower, whatever those things you have to get done. And then I love this halt. Am I hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Because wow, that can really affect our mood. So assess that. Am I feeling any of those? My favorite mood boosters. What can this be? Do I like to, for me, I love to put on Seinfeld. Just this show that I don't have to think about. It's funny. I like the characters. So what's something that boosts my mood? Um, People to reach out to. Again, when we're in the process of grief, our mind is not always clear. So who can you talk to that will actually be there for your emotional support? And I love this. Have I been as good of a friend to myself today as I would be to someone else I love? A lot of times we are so hard on ourselves and we give a lot of grace to others. And I want to encourage you to give yourself grace as you are caregiving and when you do experience the death of the one you're caring for. My favorite distractions, this could be going for a drive, taking the dogs for the walk, so anything, something that distracts you. And then places I feel calm. I love my backyard. So just sitting out there is peaceful to me. And so just putting that on there. And this form you might fill out when you first start grieving, and you might edit it and change it down the process. You need to find your new normal. This is so important. And so this can work on forgiving yourself, celebrate how well you did at caregiving. You've got to sleep. You have probably lost a lot of sleep as a caregiver. You might be going through some confusion. We talked about it earlier. What's my role now? What's my identity? You might have time might be overwhelming when you're thinking of your future, but just break it down to one day at a time. Loneliness is very common, so I hope that you will focus on rebuilding some type of social network. Activities, will you make sure you're not only keeping your body engaged, but your mind as well? Take care of you. You had to be strong for someone else. Now it's time to be strong for yourself. And embrace life now. It is not being disloyal to your loved one because you're looking on to try to find what is this new normal. And this was just a study talking about protective factors that can help if you're going through grief and loss to help you stay resilient and help you recover. That says to stay in continuous contact with support, talk about your trauma to someone you trust, use positive emotions, use laughter and humor, find positive meaning in the trauma. Can we find that silver lining? And also helping others. Sometimes when we take that focus off of ourselves and we help others, that helps us heal through the process. Here's a lot of stuff. You hear a lot of stuff about self-care. I just want to point out small acts count. It doesn't have to be this huge thing that you do, and that self-care looks different for everyone. But a huge one that a lot of the literature talks about is practicing gratitude. So in the midst of pain and hurting, if you can just list one to three things that you are grateful for, it changes our mindset, what we call reframing in therapy of instead of that glass half empty, making that glass half full. This here, I'm not going to go over this, but it's such a great resource. This tells you what some suggestions on what to do if you're experiencing grief or traumatic grief and loss. And it tells you why And then it tells you how. So one of them says connect with others. Social support is so important if you're going through grief and loss. How can you do it? Well, it can be a support group, it could be texting, it doesn't always have to be in person, but finding a way. Another one is building on your strengths because trauma can negatively impact the way you view yourself, trauma or grief. And so finding what your strengths are can help you in when you're finding out what is that new normal. So I put here a link here on finding your strengths because sometimes we forget what all they are. So go through this and find out, remember what your strengths are, and that can help you cope. This right here is just another exercise to do with your strengths. List the strengths you possess that help you in relationships. Describe a specific time your strengths were able to help you in a relationship. New ways you could use your strengths in relationships. These are things I would do if I had clients in therapy. Sometimes, and you do need to get professional help. And so make your primary care doctor aware if you've experienced trauma or if you're going through grief and loss. And I love this advice. It says, help them understand what's helpful for you during this office visit. Maybe you need someone with you. Maybe you need the professional to be more gentle than normal. So really just expressing that to them as well. I want to briefly go over some of these resources. This is my mental health. Do I need help? So you work through this. Am I experiencing mild symptoms? Here's what I can do. Are my symptoms getting severe? Here's what I need to do. There's a podcast you can listen to, and it talks about trauma. And so that is one you can listen to. And on the right side, I've given you some more books and podcasts about grief. There's one called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And there's one called What's Your Grief? And so if you like to listen, if that helps you, there's some suggestions. This is from the Trauma Foundation. Highly recommended books. You might have even heard of some of these. If you've gone through trauma, these are some books for you to check out. Additional resources, there's a Trauma Survivors Network. There's Hope for Bereaved, free services and helpline. If you're feeling overwhelmed, you can text 741-741 to get support. You can also text if things are getting real bad and you're thinking, I don't want to keep living. You can text 988 and it is a crisis line. It is 24/7 trained professionals. And you can text, you can call, you can even chat online. 988, you can call from anywhere in the US. If you're a veteran, there's a crisis line you see there. So in summary, we talked about a lot of stuff. In summary, we talked about trauma, its impact, and its symptoms. We talked about grief, the different types of grief. Grief as a caregiver. We looked at the grief intensity scale that you could complete. We touched on theories and we covered some symptoms. We talked about traumatic grief, that unexpected or violent grief, some causes and some symptoms. And then we touched on some different coping strategies, that life lessons, what I learned from grief article you could read about, the grief care plan that you could print and fill out and refer to, finding your new normal, and sometimes getting professional help. And then I just shared some other additional resources as well. That's a lot of information.
Woo, woo, good information. Things that I have not seen before, to just remind you that if you registered for the session today, in a couple of days, you will receive a follow-up email. Natalee's presentation as a PDF will be there, so you can just click on those hot links and go right to that information. That's exciting. There was so much there, Natalee, I hadn't heard before. If you have questions or comments, you are welcome to put them in the chat box, or you can unmute your microphone and join in the conversation. Let's get over here though. GJ, regarding self-comfort, I love this metaphor. I use the metaphor of being a boat in the ocean. Anchoring is deliberate, restful time, maybe even with a time limit. And drifting is when I'm not paying attention and there's no intention behind it. Isn't that great?
I love that. I love metaphors because I'm not really good at thinking of them. And so when you can share those, that's really good because it's perfect because sometimes we do just need to drift and that's
Yeah,
okay. I love that. And then sometimes we need to throw the anchor down. Yes, thank you so much.
that's a great one. Great one, great one. Anybody have a question or comment?
It is a lot of information, I know.
Yeah, everybody's head's kind of swimming.
Eh, yeah.
Well,
It
while
is.
you're thinking about that, let me tell you what's coming up on the Caregiver Teleconnection, and we're zooming towards March, but right now we're still in February. So Tuesday, February the 20th at 10 o'clock Central Time is going to be Voices of Alzheimer's with Jim Taylor. Let me see a little bit what it says here. It's talking about the journey and helping someone with Alzheimer's is a journey. I've been doing it for several years for a neighbor, a friend. Okay. And then on Thursday, February the 22nd at 10 o'clock Central Time is a Spanish language session. Minerva, can you tell us what that one is?
Sure. The one on the 22nd is Vida saludable para su cerebro y cuerpo. Consejos de las últimas investigaciones.
Woo! And it means in English.
Um, how to have a healthy life for your body and your mental health.
Okay, great, great. So if you have friends, neighbors, family members that would benefit from a Spanish language session, please tell them about that one on Thursday, the 22nd. And then our final session, Wednesday, February the 28th at 10 o'clock Central Time. I'll be back with you with Dr. Elliot Montgomery-Sklar and Lucy Bearlack. Going to be talking about the importance and benefits of eating healthy while caregiving. Oh, yeah. That's a good one because that's
That
one
would be a good
kinda,
one.
yeah, we slide through that one, don't we, Natalie?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. You know, that comfort food sounds really good when you're
Um,
stressed, doesn't it?
it does. It
Yeah.
does.
New calendar will be out before too awfully long. I know we've been signing up for different sessions, so you should be seeing that pretty quick. You can always go to our website to find our podcast. This will be made into a podcast. I have that on the chat box there, www.caregiverteleconnection.org, our customer service representative number, and you'll get to Minerva and she'll be happy to help you if you have caregiver questions or access to resources. So, anybody else have a question, a comment? I'm like Natalie, that's a lot of information. I can't wait to get the hard copy so I can go back through it. Yeah,
I just
Natalie,
put my email there. Yeah.
yeah, so you can
Anyone's welcome
reach
to
Natalie
email me as
there.
well.
Yeah, for sure. She'd be happy to talk with you.
I'm really glad that you brought up the difference of the different kinds of grief. Unfortunately, my husband had terminal cancer and I lost my husband, and it was a 2-year journey. And my girlfriend was helping me through that and unexpectedly lost her husband in a tragic car accident.
Oh, goodness.
And the grief that we both experienced, we'd often, not compare, but, is it better to have someone prolonged and see them pass away, or not better, but,
Right.
and
Yeah.
what the difference is and everything. And it's been a journey for us both, because for me, I feel like I had that time to have those words with my husband and say goodbye and live my life in honor of him. And she is still held back in so many ways because he went so suddenly.
Oh, yes. She probably is going through traumatic grief, and I would encourage her to get with a professional, and not just any professional, one that works on traumatic grief. And if she's like, I'm not into that, at least get to a support group and definitely let her primary care physician know what she's going through. Sometimes we listen to our primary care physician more than we listen to family or friends. And so if she'll definitely let them know as well, that might help. But yes, it's definitely two ends of the spectrum there. Thank you.
Wow. We have a couple more minutes if anybody else has a question or a comment. I've got to ask Polly. There's a picture of something. Where is that picture? Polly, you can put it in the chat box if you want. And Sonesius, he said that was a really great example, and it really was, Denise. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh.
That's wonderful. Yes, Polly, where are you? Or where's that picture of?
Colorado.
Oh, okay. I saw the mountains out in the distance, but it looks kind of deserty in the foreground, so I had to ask. Thank you, Polly. Any other questions, comments? Okay, I'm not going to hold you over for 2 minutes just because. So did you
Thank
have
you for
close?
coming.
That's right. You have closing comments, Natalie?
Just thank you for coming. It's a hard subject. And again, you're welcome to use this information, share it, take it back to colleagues, friends, family, and use it to help you and help others.
Yeah. I have somebody right now that's in the grief process that I'm going to share some of this with. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was our pleasure to be with you, and we certainly do look forward to seeing you on future sessions. Remember, the podcasts are there to help you. Lots of presenters, lots of topics. You can find them on our website or go to YouTube and search WellMed, and they will pop up for you there. So enjoy the rest of your day as best you can. And Natalie, I look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right. Take care.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.